Freedom and Security, the Second Amendment, and the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. I'm Susanna Woodhead, and this is Bookmarks. Hello and welcome to Bookmarks. I'm your host, Susanna Woodhead. The issue of guns has been a constant struggle in America. With each mass shooting, there are renewed calls for stricter gun control, which in turn results in more gun sales and vigorous defense of gun rights and the Second Amendment. Scott McPherson of the Future Freedom Foundation has weighed in on this debate with his new book, Freedom and Security, the Second Amendment and the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. Mr. McPherson joins us today via Skype. He is a policy advisor at the Future of Freedom Foundation and an advocate of the Free State Project. He lives in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And joining us to critique the book is James Hedrick. He is a federal government contractor and a PhD candidate in political science at Rice University. He has served as a legislative fellow in the U.S. Senate, a presidential management fellow with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, an agricultural lobbyist, and a Democratic campaign staffer. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Susanna.
Thank you.
So, Scott, could you give us in a nutshell the main thesis of your book?
Sure. Well, first of all, just let me say thank you for the opportunity to come on the show. This is fantastic. The issue or the subject of the right to keep and bear arms has been of interest to me for a long time, and it sort of dovetails with my interest in history as well. So when Jacob Hornberger at the Future of Freedom Foundation asked me to, actually pestered me for years to write a book on the subject, and I had some time on my hands about a year ago, and I thought I'd take the opportunity to sort of offer, I guess, kind of an introduction to the subject. I certainly wanted to try to talk about some things that hadn't really been discussed before, but I certainly had no desire to reinvent the wheel. I really just wanted to take the opportunity to sit down and kind of review a lot of the source material that I'd been studying for 20 years now, and put some of it down on paper in a way that might help people understand the issue of the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms and the importance of both.
Excellent. So, James, could you tell us a little bit about your critique of the book?
Sure. First, again, as Scott said, thanks for having me today. I'm glad to be here. I think it was an interesting introduction. I think it was some interesting, a little bit of interesting history about both the obligation of military service and the presence of guns and other weaponry in societies. I think, though, that what I want to get to is the chapters are laid out pretty effectively. And what I want to talk about a little bit first is the issue of this history. And Scott, I want to get your take on the fact that I don't think when you're discussing the Anglo-Saxons, when you're discussing the German migration of tribes across Europe, when you're talking about the feudal requirement to maintain weaponry and maintain gear, I don't think you're talking about the same thing that's a well-regulated militia and the right to keep and bear arms in the Constitution. One is universal enforced conscription by the state, and the other is a well-regulated militia and defense. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on what you think the connection between those two things is.
Well, certainly when the framers of the Constitution wrote the Second Amendment, these were individuals that were very they had quite an understanding of history. They knew that for centuries not just the right but the obligation of an individual to be armed, both for the defense of himself and his family, but also for the defense of his community and his country, his society, was something that stretched certainly all the way back, at least as far back as the Germanic tribes that people like Tacitus and Caesar were writing about two millennia ago. The idea that individual ownership of weaponry was service was certainly a part of that, but it was also an understanding that to own a weapon was sort of the culminate, was sort of the ultimate in the rights that a citizen could exercise. In fact, Tacitus said that amongst the Germans, it was when a young man reached the age where he could first bear arms that was the point at which he became a true citizen. And there was, as I said, there was most certainly attached to that the idea that one would be obligated to defend himself, his family, his tribe, his community in the event of war. That's absolutely true, but never at any point did anyone ever suggest that military service was the only reason a person should own weapons. The framers of the Constitution understood this. They knew that people had not just the right but the obligation to protect themselves, and that the best way to do that was protecting the individual right to keep and bear arms.
But I think that anything, and there's a certain amount of sense to that, but I think that you're talking about the difference between the Second Amendment as written, both in the individualist and in the collectivist interpretation of it, that is very, very different in its essence than anything about forced conscription and forced requirements to maintain weaponry, which is the source of their military strength and the source on which a king or whatever ruler we want to call it was able to not only defend but also expand his empire and also keep people in line.
There was no. If we start back at the Germanic tribes and the Anglo-Saxon tribes, these were highly democratic societies. The whole notion that there would be some political leader that could compel military service was really kind of absurd. As I discussed in the book, really what was expected was that people would attach themselves voluntarily to people of a certain renown.
I have a question about it. So I found it interesting that for most of the history of the United States that slaves did not have gun ownership, and it wasn't until more recently. I wonder how that affected slavery over the ages, and I'd love to hear both of your comments and thoughts.
Scott, go ahead.
Sure, that's a great question. Obviously, not just in the United States, but in any society that has had legal slavery, it's been in the interest of the ruling elite to make sure that the slaves were unarmed. However, that's not true exclusively for blacks in America. I want to stress that. Slaves would not have been allowed to be armed, but there were pockets, there were communities throughout the United States of free blacks, and they did own guns, and they did use them to defend themselves, and they did use them in militia service as well.
But I think that when you start to talk about slave societies in the United States is the one we're discussing at the moment, not only the right to keep and bear arms is not the right to own weaponry was not the sole right that they were restricting. They were restricting the right to literacy. They were restricting the right to assembly. They were restricting a number of different rights. There was an entire system of oppression meant to keep that in line. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that system was kept in check, and the slave society was kept in check through violence from the top and through violence from the minority, particularly from the planter class in the South. They had the guns, they had the weaponry, and they maintained them to keep the society down through violence. Scott, go ahead and let you maybe give your thesis a little bit on sort of, I believe it's chapter 3 or 2 about the Constitution and the development of the Constitution, the Second Amendment.
Sure. Well, it's hard to know where to begin. I guess
it is a big topic.
What's interesting about our form of government, the whole concept of a constitutional republic, at least as it was envisaged by the framers, was that the rights of the people, the rights of individuals, the right to speak freely, the right to practice the religion of your choice, the right to a jury trial, the right to keep and bear arms. These were all rights that pre-existed government. This wasn't something they came up with, going all the way back to John Locke a century before, and even well beyond that. It was widely understood that individuals have rights and that government exists to protect those rights. And that's why Jefferson wrote that quite expressly in the Declaration of Independence. So when the Constitution was written, there was a great deal of concern that a new federal government would have the power, or would use its power to disarm the people. Obviously, there was concern that the new federal government would infringe the liberties of the people in other ways, but most certainly the concern about protecting the right to keep and bear arms was very much on the minds of the framers of the Constitution. Now, they thought in the minds of the Federalists, or what we know today as the Federalists, there was no need for a Bill of Rights because there was no authority in the Constitution for Congress or the President to disarm the people. And one of the criticisms of the whole idea of a Bill of Rights was that there was no need to protect something that the government has no power to infringe. That wasn't enough for a large number of people in our society at the time. Those that came known as the anti-federalists wanted a greater protection for the liberties of the people. They wanted it expressly written in the Constitution that Congress could not infringe on the ability of people to speak freely or a free press, and included in that was their concern that Congress would disarm the people, and they expressly did not want that to happen.
No, let's talk about that though. Scott. As you know, and as I'm sure you're well aware, there were a number of different proposals for a version of the Second Amendment, or some version of the Keep the Bear Arms, or some militia, or anything like that. Now, the New Hampshire proposal was much more dedicated toward individual rights. The New Hampshire proposal 12th, the Congress shall never disarm any citizen unless such has been an actual rebellion. Now, why do you think that we win with the much more, and I don't think this is up for argument, it's a much less clear and much more obscure version of the Second Amendment that we got than something that was definitely and specifically dedicated to the individual right to bear arms rather than the right to participate in military service?
Well, as a Democratic Party strategist, I would hope you would understand the mess that is politics. We had at the time about 3 million people spread out across 13 states. I think that to try and understand all of the thinking that went on at that time and every individual's thoughts and every individual's ideas would be impossible. There were a number of different wordings for the Second Amendment, as well as the other
many that were much stronger with an individual right to carry and keep firearms and weaponry, which is not
the
what
right
eventually went into the Constitution.
The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed is pretty explicit.
Only if you miss the first half of the Second Amendment, which is a well-regulated militia.
I'd be happy to discuss that half.
Well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about that then. We'll talk about a collective right to bear arms as understood in military service. And what you didn't get was a very explicit individualist right to bear arms when that very easily could have been any number of proposals. There was a Pennsylvania proposal, a Massachusetts proposal that never got out of their own state committees. There was a New Hampshire proposal which was voted down and replaced with what you got, which was, I don't know if you want to call it watered down, but certainly less definitive of a well-regulated militia. So it could have been more individualistic. It could have been a specific prohibition that the government never disarm an individual or infringe upon those rights, but we didn't get that. What we got out of the Constitutional Convention. So the argument made in the book, I think, is that everybody was on board, and everybody was not on board. Madison wasn't even on board.
James, we didn't get the Second Amendment out of the Constitutional Convention that was introduced in Congress by James Madison.
I understand it was
and
introduced
when James
in Congress.
Madison went before Congress, he had in his own personal notes, he had a list of the rights that were he and others were hoping would be protected by the Bill of Rights. And when he, in his very own notes on what would become the Second Amendment, it was written explicitly that what was being protected was an individual right, as well as an individual's right to speak freely or to practice his own religion, or the religion of his choosing. Now, one thing's absolutely for certain. I think that across the spectrum of thought at the time, you had people that would have been far more enthusiastic about what we might call the collective use of the right to keep and bear arms as far as for military service, for militia service. And at the other end of the spectrum, we had the more Jeffersonian view, which placed more emphasis on the individual right. And it makes complete sense to me that to satisfy both of those, we would have what we
What we know for certain, though, James, is that if there was anyone at the time of the writing of the Second Amendment who thought that there was no individual right to keep and bear arms, those people stayed very quiet. I think that they didn't, because I think that if they did, what you would have gotten was an
Please give me an
individual right
example.
to keep
I
and
mean,
bear
I'd
arms.
be happy to hear an example.
Okay, and I'm telling you that
of
the
someone
New
who
Hampshire
publicly spoke out against the individual right to keep and bear arms.
Yes. Now, moving on from that, because obviously what we've got is a compromise here, and you're telling it yourself, both an individualistic and a collectivist.
No, not a compromise. I think
It's a compromise. The Second Amendment language that went in there is a compromise, which is the definition of a compromise.
Let's try not to talk over each other. Let's try to let each person talk, because I'm having trouble being able to follow at this point.
Fair enough.
Okay.
But what you're saying there is that there was a compromise between a more Jeffersonian and a more Madisonian view, a more Federalist and anti-Federalist view. It's a definition of a compromise. So what you got was basically two independent phrases: a well-regulated militia and the right to keep and bear arms. And I think that you're overselling the case of an individualistic right to bear arms. Not the least of which is that most of these people came from state government situations and introduced bills on their own which restricted the ability to exercise the right to go fire a weapon wherever you wanted. 1700s, 1800s, you had federal censuses, the plural of census of the arms that people owned and had. You had restrictions on the ability to fire weaponry, to hunt deer. You had the restrictions on the ability to keep a weapon if you engaged in public, intoxication, things of that nature. I think that to jump from even the idea that it is an individualistic right, an individual's right to own and keep a weapon, to the fact that there is no basis for restriction on the ability to exercise that right, both in the keeping and the using of the weaponry, I think it is a very large logical leap.
Well, I think you've presented a bit of a false dichotomy here, the idea that because I have the right to keep and bear arms, that I should then be able to walk out into my front yard, point my weapon towards downtown Portsmouth and pull the trigger.
I also don't shot fire in front
the
of
idea
theaters.
that there's some kind of a contradiction there, or that that's in any way a restriction on my right to keep and bear arms is absurd.
Well, I think that's wonderful. I think that the fact that you're admitting that a reasonable set of restrictions and a reasonable set of regulations on one's ability to both keep and...
No such thing. No such thing. The laws that I support are those that prevent individuals from violating the equal rights of others to live their lives as they see fit. And if I walk outside my house and I point my gun at my neighbor's house and I pull the trigger, that's endangering my neighbor. However, if I keep my gun in my house and I don't point it at anybody and I only use it for recreation or for self-defense, that is a perfectly legitimate use of my firearm. There's no compromise there. There's no need for regulation there. It's simple. You can't put other people's lives at risk. I don't understand how in any way that can be construed as a regulation of the right to keep and bear arms. That's simply a law that's necessary in any civilized society if we hope for people to live peacefully together.
I think,
now, as far as the issue of an individual right and what some might have called a stress on a more on the right to keep and bear arms for purposes of military service, that is the real genius of the Second Amendment. Regardless of whether someone saw the importance of firearms ownership in an individualistic sense, or they went all the way across the spectrum to the other side and saw it only as something valuable for military service, is really immaterial. The purpose of the amendment was to prohibit the federal government from disarming people. And so regardless of what purpose you might have preferred that people use their weapons, they could not do so had they no weapons to use. And it was to protect that right to keep and bear arms that the Second Amendment was written.
All right, let's take some questions from our viewers. So we have some questions from our viewers, and our first question is from Virgil Fuller, and he said, should the law distinguish between gun owners who pose no threat and those who should be considered dangerous? James, could you expound on that?
As we go back to false dichotomies, I think Scott and I both probably mentioned those so far in the conversation. That gets real close to the good guy with a gun versus the bad guy with a gun. And that's a bad argument. It's the behavior we're worried about. It's the outcomes that we're worried about. And those are the things that should concern people. There's plenty of room in the law right now to write restrictions on felon gun ownership, on gun ownership by the mentally ill and a variety of other things. I think that what one has to be more concerned with is behavior and having a proscriptive right, some sort of training, some sort of regulation. You got to go learn how to drive a car. You pretty much ought to learn how to fire a gun if you want to have one.
Okay. And Scott?
I think James made an invaluable point that what we ought to be looking at precisely is behavior. And if we hope to live in a free society, any law that restricts me from taking action, absent some evidence that I either am committing a violent act or intend to commit a violent act, is inconsistent with James's own position. I absolutely agree. We shouldn't be worrying about, or what we should be worrying about is behavior. And James mentioned felons. Well, I used to agree with that position until it suddenly dawned on me many years ago that it's extremely easy to become a felon in this country. And the Democratic Party that James works for.
I don't work for the Democratic Party, but please keep repeating it.
Spends a lot of time talking about protecting the rights of minorities in this country. And if you're an 18-year-old black kid that gets caught smoking a joint and you're convicted for that, you're a felon. That means for the rest of your life, you don't get to own a gun to protect your family. Now, I would hope James would agree that if we're going to evaluate whether somebody should have a gun or not based on their behavior, that the example I just gave, certainly that would not apply, would it?
Well, what I was saying is not that it should. What I was saying is that if one wants to go out and drive a car, one has to go get licensed, one has to learn how to drive a car, one has to prove that one can use a car safely in society and in the population. And if you drive too fast, if you wreck your car, if you hit somebody, you can have that ability restricted. And I think the same thing should apply to gun ownership. I think that it's unconscionable that you can go out, purchase a gun without having any licensing, without having any training whatsoever.
How do you feel about that, Scott?
Wow, I guess, again, where to start? I think that the idea that, first of all, we assume that because you have to have a license to drive a car, that is a good thing. And I don't necessarily agree. I know lots of people with young kids that, and I know from my own experience, I drove for 3 years without an automobile license from the age of 14 to the age of 17. I was never pulled over. I was never involved in an accident. At 17, I went out and got a driver's license, and within a week, I got my first traffic ticket, or my first speeding ticket. So somehow I managed to effectively and safely operate a vehicle for 3 years without having a license. However, should I before going out on the road, should I have been a safe driver? Absolutely, and I was. And I think that's what's happening in our society today, and it has been since time immemorial, was that it was the responsibility of parents and grandparents and uncles and other members of the community to make sure that children were learning to use firearms and learning to do so safely. But the idea that somehow getting a license to do so somehow makes me safe.
It does. It
makes me a safe firearm owner is absurd, and there's simply no data to support that.
There is a whole bunch of data to support that, and I think it's probably the time we got to it.
That sounds good. We have another question first. Nadine Greer wants to know, why not treat guns similar to the way we treat cars? Which is running back to the question that we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm. One of the reasons is because, let's face it, guns are exceptionally dangerous. They are. And if you don't know how to fire one, if you don't know how to operate one, I find it very, very odd that we as a society feel okay with you wandering around with one. And the differences between gun violence, homicides, death, accidental death in the United States versus other countries in the world is just simply amazing. The differences in the death per capita rate. Owning a gun is incredibly dangerous. Driving a car is incredibly dangerous. And the rest of society has a right to know that you are capable of both operating that car and operating a firearm.
I couldn't disagree anymore. I don't think you have the right to. You don't have the right to feel good, James. You don't have even the right to feel safe. What you do have the right. You do have the right to be.
I have the right to life, liberty, and property. I believe, if we're going back to our John Locke.
Well, and those aren't the only rights you have. But you certainly don't have.
That are pretty important.
Yeah. Well, I think think we can agree on that. But you certainly don't have the right to feel good.
I'm not arguing that I have the right to feel good.
And you don't even have the right to feel safe. The fact that you might feel less safe because your neighbor owns a gun really doesn't mean a damn thing.
I'm not feeling safe. I am less safe.
Actually, no. I mean,
yes, you are. The
more safer
statistics
if your neighbor
fully
owns a
support
gun.
this, and we can go talk about them.
That's why the vast majority of people in this country either own guns or are in support of people's
Gun
right
ownership
to
in this country is at about 1/3 of the people in this country own a gun. Now, states with the highest rate of gun ownership have 6.8 times the rate of firearm assaults, 2.8 times the rate of firearm homicides, twice the rate of homicides.
We were asked earlier not to talk over each other. I thought I was going to have an
Yeah, I thought you would stop then, sir. Go ahead.
All right. As far as the equating guns to automobiles, automobiles are far more dangerous. We just the other day, the numbers were released on automobile-related deaths in the United States, and it was about 40,000 people in 2015. So automobiles are far more dangerous than firearms. There's no question of that. The idea that we should treat guns like cars, I mean, I would rather see us treating cars like guns. I think that if I can go out and I can demonstrate that I can safely operate a motor vehicle, then you have no moral authority whatsoever to restrict me or to prevent me from getting myself around by a car. And the way in which I demonstrate I'm incapable of doing that in a free society is when I do something that's not safe, when I do something that violates your rights. And if I don't do that, then what you need to do is essentially be quiet and leave me alone and let me get on about my life. And the same is true for automobiles. Now, what's interesting about this particular take on firearms is when people start talking about treating guns like cars, I don't think they really understand the kind of swamp that they're getting themselves into, because the last time I checked, if I can go out and I can pass a written test and a driver's test, I can drive the biggest truck I want. Now, are you going to be comfortable, James, with me being able to go out and take a written test and demonstrate that I can operate a bazooka?
Unfortunately, we're not going to have
I
time.
should be allowed to own one? I mean,
Class C licenses and tractor
be
trailers.
careful.
Okay, that's all we have time for. Again, the book is Freedom and Security, the Second Amendment and the Right to Keep and Bear Arms by Scott McPherson. Thanks to Mr. McPherson for joining us to discuss the book, and to PhD candidate James Hedrick for his critique. And thank you for watching Bookmarks. I'm Susanna Woodhead. We'll see you next time.